Okay.
All right, welcome everyone to our SWAC seminar series. This is our second seminar for the fall semester. Today we have three of our faculty members who will be presenting their research with us. The first one is Dr. Melissa Wilson. She's assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. And her main areas of research are manure management and water quality. So let's hear Melissa's talk.
All right, hello everyone. Thank Vasu. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can tell me if I'm on the correct screen here.
Sure.
All right, we good?
Yes, we can see your, we can see your full screen. Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you for introducing me. As Vasu said, I'm an assistant professor and I work on manure management and water quality. I started here in 2017, so I'm just finishing up my third full field season of research. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with our research and what we're doing about all of the manure that's in the state. This background picture I have here in my title is one of my favorites because gentleman, we went to his farm. This is a horse farm and he had a manure happens pile or sign right by his manure pile. So figured that's a very apt title for when I'm talking about my research. So to give you a little background of why manure management is important in the state, it's because we have a lot of livestock. We have roughly 23,000 registered feedlots in the state. And speaking with some of the folks that I work with at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, there's probably only about 17,000 to 20,000 that are actually active. Sometimes farms are registered as feedlots, but they may or may not have animals. And that's particularly true in a year like this, where they had reduced slaughter capacity. So some farms may or may not have all of the animals that they said that they would have on their permit. This graphic that we have here on the right side of the screen shows where the feedlots are in Minnesota. The data is from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. This graphic was put together by the Environmental Working Group. And you can see the blue dots are beef, the green dots are dairy, the orange is poultry, and the red is swine. And predominantly the livestock is really kind of in the bottom half of the state, but you can see there's a good bit in the center part of the state, especially dairy and beef, as well as some of the poultry. And then you can see the southern half of the state, still a lot of beef and dairy, but also a lot of swine too. So this is important because this is primarily in some of our agricultural regions. And roughly speaking, we think that the livestock produce about 50 million metric tons of manure annually. And this is on a kind of as excreted from the manure or from the livestock basis. So, as excreted is different than what might be as applied. We think what is applied takes up about 25 to 40% of the actual agricultural land in the state. So despite having a lot of animals, we don't have too much manure for the state when you're thinking about it in context of how much agricultural land we have. But as you can see, the livestock are pretty concentrated in some regions. So in some areas, we may have more livestock than we have land to apply the manure. But some of the recent studies have suggested that this is actually pretty minimal in Minnesota. So we're lucky in that regards. But some of the challenges with manure lie in climate change. We have a lot of different things going on. It's getting wetter and warmer in particular seasons, and that impacts how fast nutrients can release from manure. Because the one thing about manure that makes it complicated is it's not like a fertilizer. It has to, sorry, my kids are stepping into the background, distracting me a little bit. But the manure has to break down. So some of the nutrients will be available in the second or third year, as well as the first year. So climate change is really impacting that. Then there's the application windows we have to think about. Traditionally, you apply manure when there's no crops on the field. So fall and spring in Minnesota are the typical times, although we do see some summer application and some winter application. But because it's been getting really wet, particularly in fall and spring the last couple of years, there's been a lot of difficulty in getting manure applied, such that it gets to the point where we're starting to apply manure in less ideal conditions that might result in more environmental issues. And then speaking of environmental issues, we have to think about how can we best balance the benefits of manure, improving soil health by adding organic matter to the soil, recycling nutrients, those sorts of things, with the environmental pollution aspects. Because with manure and all the organic matter and good things you get with it, you also get some bad things, like if you over apply the nutrients and pathogens, things like that too. And then finally, there's some new technologies that are coming on board, but how do they impact the nutrient management aspect of manure? That's still yet to be seen. For instance, there's different treatments that we're seeing for manure that are starting to be used. So how do those impact nutrient availability? So again, kind of tying back to the climate change things, we have climate change going on, we got new technologies, we have people wanting to improve soil health. So all of these are really intertwined. So I'm going to get into some of our projects that we're working on. One of the first ones that I started here in Minnesota was looking at this nutrient availability. When you look at our guidelines in Minnesota for how to determine nutrient availability, we have certain numbers. For instance, for swine manure, if you inject the manure under the soil surface as you're applying it, you can assume about 80% of the nitrogen will be available the first year, and the rest of it will release over subsequent years. But what we've found is that these numbers were generated from research probably 20 years ago or more. And again, we know we've been having these changing climate situations. So how is that impacting the nutrient availability? That on top of some of the new technology that we're seeing might impact this nutrient availability as well. So in 2018, we started a somewhat long-term project at the Lamberton Sites Research Center, so the Southwestern Research and Outreach Center, and at Waseca, the Southern Research and Outreach Center, where we applied 6 different types of manure. And then we compared it to plots where we have differing rates of nitrogen. So that way we can see where the manure lines up to where the fertilizer is, because the fertilizer, we know how much we applied and we know it should be available the first year. The manure, we might not know how much is available the first year. So hopefully we can figure that out. This picture we see here was taken last year. So this is after the second year of the site, or sorry, this is the first year of the second year where we started the project again. And you can see that the corn definitely looks different across the different replications. So we were already seeing some nutrient differences within that first year. Here's a closer up picture. What we did is we applied the 6 different types of manure, ranging from turkey litter, 2 different types of dairy. One is traditional raw dairy. Another one has been treated with a liquid solid separation system. We did bedded beef pack. We did composted chicken litter. And we did finishing swine manure too. And we applied them all at the same rate using the University of Minnesota guidelines. And by same rate, I mean the same available nitrogen rate. So that might differ then for how much tonnage or gallons we put on for each plot. But we should have had the same amount of nitrogen. And this first picture that you see on your left shows that we were not seeing the same amount of nitrogen being applied. Here we have turkey litter. And on the furthest left, and then kind of in the middle here is our bedded beef pack. So we saw significant differences in our nutrient release from our bedded beef pack. Some of what we think might have been due to that bedding, straw bedding, corn stalks, whatever it might be used, and tie up some of the nitrogen. And that's not something we're really taking into consideration right now in our current guidelines. So after we applied the manure the first year, we did not apply manure in the second or third year, but we were seeing if there's any second year or third year nitrogen credits left over. And this aerial photograph that we see here is our 2 different sites. This one closest to the highway up here was set up in 2018, I believe. And this one a little further, this is actually north, but in the picture, it's a little lower in the picture. This site was set up in 2019. And the dark green strips are where we have our full fertilizer rates. Our lighter green strips are where we had manure 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So you can see that there's certainly not enough nitrogen being released from the manure, but what we're doing is seeing if there is at least a little bit of nitrogen still being applied. So that one, our 3rd year is coming to an end. We'll be harvesting that soon for our first set of plots. We started up in 2018, and then we'll do the experiment that we started in 2019, one more year to see if we have any 3rd year credits. So that one is kind of still in the middle of the project, but it's been very interesting so far to see the differences between the different manure types. So besides nutrient availability, one of the other things that has been really challenging to farmers and commercial manure haulers is getting the manure applied in a timely fashion and in a way that kind of keeps the nutrients in place where we want them. So traditionally, if we're fall applying, we recommend waiting until soil temperatures are pretty cold, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I believe that's somewhere around 10 degrees Celsius, so that the microbes in the soil have really stopped causing nitrification to happen and mineralization, because if the soil microbes are slowed down, then we're keeping nitrogen in a form that's not going to leach or denitrify. So one of the things we're trying to do is integrate cover crops into the systems where we might fall apply manure. We have 4 locations that we're doing this at. We're doing 2 research stations, the West Central Research Station out in Morris, and again at SWAC, so this in Waseca, the Southern Research and Outreach Center. We have 2 on-farm locations as well. And we have kind of a complicated set of studies going on. One, we're looking at following sweet corn. If we can get cover crops planted really early, can we try applying manure earlier when the soil temperatures are still warm, above 50 degrees? Then if we apply manure late, when the soil temperatures are lower, we might get an idea of if those cover crops helped trap nutrients the next year. We also did a project where we interseeded into continuous silage corn. So this is a nice picture. We got a really good stand of growth last year and this year, had timely rains. And again, since silage corn is coming off, we're trying that application timing again. We're early and late, before soil temperatures are cool and after. We're also looking at the soybean corn rotation. So we're interseeding into soybeans to try to get good growth growing. And then with our on-farm trials, we're actually looking at strip till systems where they're strip tilling manure into their cover crops. Unfortunately, it's a little more difficult working with the on-farm situations because they actually have a farm to run. So we got our cover crop planted a little later than we anticipated last year, and you can see a little bit of green out in the field there. So there's a cover crop and it came on in spring, but in the fall it wasn't quite as big as we had hoped. So what we're trying to do is use these cover crops as a trap crop to capture some of the nutrients and then hold them until the next year, because we often see a lot of our leaching tends to happen late fall if it's a wet fall, and also in spring. So following all of these crops, we are now growing this year corn grain. So we'll see how these practices that we did last fall will impact corn grain this year. And we definitely saw some visual differences especially in our sweet corn following corn and our continuous silage corn. So I'm really interested to see what the corn grain yields look like this year. And saw less differences in our soybean corn, but I'm still interested to see what the yields actually look like. So we're not only looking at fall and spring application and how we can open up those windows of opportunity, we're also looking at side dressing. So side dressing is where you go in and apply manure alongside the rows of standing corn. So we're actually applying in the summer, usually early summer when the corn is small. And this is mostly on farm sites, but we also have some 2 small plot sites here on campus and also at SROC again. Apparently we really like going down to SROC. They have some hog manure down there, so it makes it easy to do some experiments. So we're doing this in 2 ways. One, we looked at a drag line system. If you're unfamiliar with manure application, you basically have these 2 different types of systems that I have pictured here. You have a big tanker that you have to continuously go back and fill up at the barn, or you can have a pump that is at the barn and pumping manure the whole way out through these tubes to be dragged behind the tractor. There's obviously pros and cons to each. With a tanker, you have more flexibility of where you haul the manure to. With a drag line, these lines can only be so long, usually at most a couple of miles. So it limits how far you can go. But you can imagine with a tanker, that's a lot of compaction because that's a lot of weight being pulled behind a tractor. Versus the dragline system, there's less weight, so potentially less compaction. But we wanted to try side dressing with both. We did, both of these are on farm with a previous grad student we had in the department, Chris Farr, that's on his family farm. And we wanted to try with the drag line because obviously dragging a giant hose full of manure over top of your corn is a little scary. So we figured why not go with like worst case scenario and try that out. With the tanker, you get more compaction, so we have to worry about that when we're driving through these corn rows, but it can go into taller corn because corn can only go so big before you drag over a hose and kill it. So we've been working on that. So far, we've been finding really good, really positive results with the drag line. The side dressing liquid swine manure was very similar to side dressing in hydrous ammonia and liquid UAN, at least in the first year. The second year, we had some technical issues where we didn't apply as much manure as we expected, and so we got lower yields. But we think, based on the first year and the fact that we knew how much less nitrogen we applied, that we could fix those problems and it'll still be a potentially positive practice in the future. Then we're also evaluating kind of some old windows for application. Winter manure application does still happen here in Minnesota. You are allowed to apply silage manures on top of snow and in frozen conditions. And again, we have climate change happening, and it's not freezing in December and staying frozen and snow covered through the end of March anymore. We're seeing more and more of these midwinter thaws. So while this practice has been considered okay, safe in the past, especially if you're on flat fields and you're far away from water bodies, we have to start considering, is this still an acceptable practice when we're considering water quality? So these are some old pictures. We are doing some newer studies as well. We're looking at dairy manure, and traditionally dairy and beef are the only ones who might be winter applying. You wouldn't really see this with a turkey litter situation or a swine manure situation. This is mostly going to be with the bovine species. So in this study that I'm showing you here, this is dairy manure at different solids contents. So one is more watered down, the middle one, than the other one. And we applied on top of snow and then watched the nutrient content in the runoff. And so this was applied just like 2 days before we had a major rain event back in 2018. And this is what the runoff looked like. And it's kind of interesting because I pulled the lids off in this order. So at first I was like, oh my gosh, it's so dark. And I saw the second one, it was still so dark. And I thought, well, maybe there's some sort of, soil in this water. That's why it's so dark. But then I pulled off the third one, which didn't have manure, and you can see how clear the water is. So yes, this is potentially a problem. And what's interesting is we did this about 2 months after application. We kept monitoring as the runoff events happened. And this is the third runoff event, what the water looked like. And you can see that it's a lot clearer for the plot where we had a lower solids content manure, but still pretty dark where we had a higher solids content manure. And what's interesting is these higher solids content manures are usually what's applied. It's usually a more solid manure that's applied in the winter. And this is collected about 2 months after that first, or about a month, sorry, after that first runoff event. So, we're seeing that runoff can potentially be problematic in the winter. One of the things that we're looking at now is not necessarily solids content, but one of my graduate students, Louise Allen, is looking at where in the snowpack can you apply the manure? If you have to apply in frozen conditions because it was too wet in the fall and get it under the snow, is that as problematic as applying on top of the snow? So we're trying to tease out these things to see if there's best management practices for farmers who may not have storage and have to apply in the winter. Another thing we're looking at is some of the new technology. If you remember, I mentioned a process called liquid solid separation. This is one of the large Riverview dairies that we visited in Minnesota. And this is a liquid solid separation system. This is what the manure, the solids part, looks like after essentially all the liquid is squeezed out of it. And some of these bigger dairies are starting to be built in what's traditionally the sugar beet growing region of Minnesota. So the sugar beet growers were really interested in knowing, will this new type of manure, this liquid separated manure, impact sugar beets? Like, where in the rotation can we use this manure to get the best bang for our buck, so to speak? So we started a project on that this past year. We fall applied liquid manure. And if you're wondering how we do research with manure, it's often by hand or some sort of gravity fed application systems. That's what you see here. And note we have an emeritus professor standing here. Dr. Lamb helped me get these projects set up. And what we did is we applied a high rate of manure, about 14,000 gallons of this liquid solid separated dairy manure, about 9,000 gallons. And then we applied just regular fertilizers, whatever was recommended. And we applied it last fall. So then we grew corn, sugar beet, or soybean. And then we'll rotate these over the next 3 years, fertilizing as appropriate every year, including the manure credits for the second and third year. But we just wanted to see again how this impacts the rotation. One fun side effect that we found out is applying manure to soybeans on a high pH soil is bad news. Wherever you see these kind of bald spots here, that was where we applied manure. It turns out high pH soils with high organic matter content additions drives iron deficiency chlorosis. And since I hadn't worked with soybeans, I didn't think about that. So there are products you can add to soybeans to help combat this, but we didn't think about it. So that was a kind of a fun thing that we learned of what not to do. And that kind of is a lot of my research. I joke with farmers that I do dumb things so that they don't have to in my research. And that was a dumb thing that we did. But overall, that's kind of what we're looking at. We're just through the first year, and soybeans were harvested, but we haven't looked at, well, harvested, they picked out 2 plants here in the one plot. But we should be able to see some differences in these pretty soon. And finally, biotreatment for manure. I think I'll talk about this pretty quickly. We're basically using bugs to eat manure to see if we can get a treated product after the fact. So these are black soldier fly. We also have vermifiltration, where this is where we're using composting worms, so red wrigglers, if you're familiar with that, to filter out the solids as the liquids part of the manure filters down and goes through kind of biological treatment. So we're seeing if that can help potentially treat manure in certain ways, especially the really liquid manures that we might get from different systems here in Minnesota. So those are kind of some little fun projects that we're doing on the side. And I wish I had the video of the little black soldier flies squiggling around, because they're pretty gross, but I kind of like them. So that is it. I look like I went over a little bit of time, but I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Contact info is at the bottom.
Thanks, Melissa. Anyone have any questions? We have time for 1 or 2 questions. I have a quick question, Melissa. So in one of your slides at the beginning where you showed the map, why is, what is the reason why all the dairy and poultry is in the central and then swine on the south? Just curious.
A lot of it's like dairies and beef and those sorts of things tend to use some grazing. So usually they're a little bit more marginal lands, which is why you see that pocket kind of in those central sands, because it makes sense to graze animals there. And especially in the southeastern corner, you'll see a lot of dairies and beef too. And that's usually kind of the hilly land, right? Is sometimes hard to grow crops on, so it's easier to graze animals. Okay. So that's why you see some of them. With the swine, I think some of it's traditionally kind of been like a lot of swine came into Iowa and then they've been kind of expanding northward. So I think that's a little bit why you see some of that in the southern parts of the state too.
Okay. Any other questions for Melissa? If not, we will thank you, Melissa, for your presentation. And I think if you have questions at the end, Melissa, will you be here till end? Yep. Okay.
Yep, I should be.
All right. Now we have Dr. Jeff Strock. Dr. Jeff Strock is a professor and soil scientist in Soil, Water, and Climate Department. His research mainly focuses on drainage water management practices and nutrient management practices. So, Dr. Strock.
Thanks, Visu. Let me get my presentation pulled up here. Okay. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about a project. It's some ongoing work that we've been doing here at Lamberton over the last 18 years or so. Some of it's newer than other parts of it. And we've integrated a lot of the work that we've been doing into a new MAES project. So that's a lot of what I'm going to be spending time talking about, and you'll understand here in a little bit the nuances of this. So just for some perspective, Melissa talked about Lamberton and Waseca. I'm at the Southwest Research and Outreach Center. Well, actually not presently since March, but we're in the Southwest. We're located in the Cottonwood River watershed, and in the image here on the right, the Research and Outreach Center encompasses this area of this map right here, and there are some waterways that interconnect and eventually lead down to the Cottonwood River. The research infrastructure that I'm going to talk about and then share results of today is in this upper picture here. And I'll move to a more blown up one so that you can see it a little better on your screens. So this project integrates in-field cropping system management research, edge-of-field bioreactor research, some edge-of-field constructed wetland research, and then some beyond the field in-stream drainage ditch research. These components, these four components that you see on the screen, have been there for different lengths of time. The ditches were installed and built in about 2002. The bioreactors were installed in 2016. The edge of field constructed wetlands in 2009. And then the infield cropping system management area is the newest area. That was in 2017. We have a couple of sources of water that we monitor. Unfortunately, these are not the only sources of water that impact the system, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But we are monitoring in an age flume surface runoff from part of our farm through these two grassed waterways. And then we are also measuring subsurface drainage from a daylighted subsurface drain. All in all, we've got about 300 acres of water that is allowed to flow into these different systems and hopefully be treated and be a little bit cleaner than leaving the farm than when it started. So I'm gonna sort of talk a little bit here quickly about the source water. In that previous slide where I showed the grassed waterway, we have observations from the surface runoff for 2017, 2018, and 2019, and observations for the subsurface drain flow from 2017, 2018, and 2019. The last 4 years, the three that I'm showing, but the last 4 years have been a bit on the wet side. 2017 was actually closest to average of the last 4 years. And so the discharge that you're seeing, the nitrate nitrogen loads and flow weighted concentrations and the dissolved reactive loads and concentrations, you can see vary a lot from year to year based on the precipitation that we have down at Lamberton. In these other two images that you see on the screen, I left the constructed wetland site in here for perspective. Two other waterways that come through. There's this one to the left that's orange, and then there's a yellow one that collects the outflow discharge water from the constructed wetlands. And then that's actually combined and then dumps into a mixing area here where it's allowed to then flow into our drainage ditch system. This site, the surface runoff water here has been unmonitored since we've started all these projects. And we've actually desired to be able to install an H-flume in this area, but the last 4 years have been so wet. So actually, we've been installing the H-flume in the wing walls this week. And as soon as I'm done giving my talk and answering questions, I'm going to go out and finish the wing walls on the system today. This area that's circled in blue, I know these are kind of hard to see, but this is where we've got 3 subsurface tile drains that are also coming into the system. We started monitoring these in 2020, and so in the future, 2021, we'll have all of the surface water and subsurface drainage water entering our systems monitored. This is a slightly different perspective. So here's the surface runoff monitoring area that we currently monitor. Here's the subsurface drain that we currently monitor. And then here's the yellow and the orange lines in that blue circled area down at the bottom of the screen. So I'll jump into a couple of slides on each one of the different aspects of the research. The ditch research has been going on the longest. We have 4 channels out in the site. The middle 2 channels are the 2 experimental channels. They're about 750 feet long. Each one of them has an H-flume at the outlet that we monitor the water flow that essentially leaves the site. So we have a control channel and a treatment channel. So if you see that illustration up in the upper right corner there, the control basically is designed to not have any kind of management in the channel. It's just allowed to flow normally. The treatment channel actually has what we're calling a low-grade weir. Basically, it's like a little check dam that allows us to raise the water level up actually any distance that we want in that ditch to increase the wetted perimeter of the ditch, to increase the storage volume of water in the ditch, and hopefully increase hydraulic residence time. So these 2 inset pictures here are of the low-grade weir. So this bottom box shows the approach section to our H-flume, and in this area right here, where you see this horizontal line, this line here represents a 12-inch low-grade weir. There are 2 6-inch boards that are in there, and this is a zoomed-in picture of it. And you see 2 features. There's one here and one here. Those are 2 orifices that we have in the bottom weir board to allow water to drain down the water behind the weir in between precipitation events during the summertime. So the discharge and nutrient reductions that we've seen, this is the 2017, 2018, 2019 data. And I'm just gonna, for the essence of time, I'm just gonna talk about the 3-year values here. So there was about a 55% reduction between the treatment and the control in terms of discharge. And I'm gonna actually circle back to that. The nitrogen load reduction was about 62%, and this is in kilograms. The flow weighted nitrate concentration was about 51%. Now, in a lot of the other work that I've done with water and drainage on the landscape, very often a lot of our nutrient reductions are really based on the water and changes in the water volumes that we have. In this particular case, though, with the ditches, we're also seeing a reduction in the flow weighted concentrations. Now, of course, I'm only showing annual values here. We do have monthly values, but I don't have enough time to go through all of that. The dissolved reactive P load also was lower with the treatment, but the flow weighted concentrations were about the same. When we come back to the discharge, We are actually doing some temperature profiling and installing some piezometers out in the field and some shallow wells to look to see where the water's going, to be able to try to account for any surface water, groundwater interactions. I don't have any quantitative values on that at this time. Our bioreactor research, here are our 9 bioreactors. There are 3 of them that are yellowish looking here. Those are insulated ones. And the insulated ones actually have corn cobs, wood chips, and then a heat coil in between the corn cobs and the wood chips. The other treatments are corn cobs, wood chips, and then a corn cob wood chip acetate treatment. In the past, we've generated the electricity for the heat tape by a propane power generator. In 2020, we actually used our solar array to generate the power for that. So when we start looking at a summary of that data from 2018 and 2019, we have the control, which was just wood chips and acetate, or wood chips and corn cobs, excuse me. The acetate was wood chips, corn cobs, and acetate, and then wood chips, corn cobs, acetate plus heat. Discharge, we saw that there's no statistically significant difference. There was a lot of variability amongst the different bioreactors, so we see a bit of a range there. We did see some statistically significant differences in the nitrogen loads and the flow weighted concentrations. So where we had acetate and then acetate plus heat, there were no differences between those two, but we did see reductions in nitrogen coming out of these bioreactors compared to the control. And then numerically speaking, we've got about a 50% reduction here between the control and that heat plus acetate treatment. For the dissolved reactive phosphorus, we don't really see that there's a lot of treatment over this annual period, statistically speaking. We jump to our constructed wetland site. We've got basically 3 different styles of constructed wetlands. We've got a surface flow style, a vertical flow style, and a horizontal flow style. And in the illustration here on the right, basically the surface flow has a permanent pool. The vertical flow has some narrow, shallow space tile in it. And then the horizontal flow is constructed of different types of gravel capped with a soil cap. When we start looking at the constructed wetland results from 2018 and 2019, again, discharge, we don't really see any difference. Whoops. The wrong slide in there. Sorry about that. I copied and pasted the wrong slide in. We'll have to jump to them. So the cropping systems research area, we basically have field sites out here. We have been double cropping corn and soybean into winter camelina, and we've had varying success with getting and then growing and then allowing ourselves the corn and the soybeans interseeded into them. Conditions over the last several years so in the treatments in the treatment blocks on the left here, we have block 2, 4, and 6, and then we have block 1, 3, and 5 on the right. So 1, 3, and 4 were actually plots that had camelina growing in it, seeded in the fall, and then the corn and the soybean interseeded in. And you can see very low corn yields where we conventionally planted corn and soybeans. You can see that we did much better in terms of the cropping system. We haven't given up on trying to use the camelina, but we do know that under wet conditions and then trying to interseed corn and soybeans under not very ideal conditions, and Melissa kind of talked about that earlier, it can be a challenge. The last thing I want to talk about here is just an opportunity that we've had. I know this is a pretty busy slide, But basically, you're looking at the site that I just talked about. And we've partnered up with the GEMS. They approached us a couple of years ago. And we've been talking and working with them on machine learning and artificial intelligence ideas using soil sensors and then measurements of our runoff, our drainage, and then precipitation modeling, monitoring and forecasting, plus management of the drainage water with actuation in our low-grade weir. We are still trying to get some funding to bring all of this to fruition, but we've basically been working on components of this to try to see if we can use technology and some of this AI, machine learning and forecasting to actually do a better job, a more dynamic job of monitoring the water. So instead of having our systems be on the passive side, that they'd be active, and it wouldn't be active because of a human being intervention, but it would be active based on the soil water status, the runoff status, the precipitation intensity, frequency, duration, and then we can use cropping systems at different landscape positions and our cover cropping system to be able to inform the artificial intelligence machine learning computer system that actually will control the actuator on the low grade weir. So just to summarize real quickly, as we've looked at a lot of our work, we've seen, it appears that through our work that we've done a really pretty good job of managing the nitrogen coming out of all of our systems individually and cumulatively out of the ditch. Phosphorus is been more of a challenge. We've gotten phosphorus to be treated in some of our systems and then, contributed as a source of phosphorus in other systems. So phosphorus is still a little bit more of a challenge for us to try to manage coming off of our landscape. But we know that the work that we're doing with it, the different styles of treatments, the practices, that one size doesn't fit all. And so we're trying to have a suite of options for producers to be able to look at and choose. And so we're trying to shoot with silver buckshot, not silver bullets. I want to mention a couple of things here too, that we're working with Satoshi and Hao, Mike and Reda, looking at some microbial composition and function in our ditches and in our modular bioreactors using some MinDrive funds. And then Anna Cates and I have a project that we submitted, it's still pending to USDA, looking at drainage requirements to maintain soil health using our cropping system sites and some of the drainage work that we have in this project. When we look at this in its entirety, the next step really in our vision is to try to scale this up from our little 300-acre area to something bigger. And I'll take a question or two if there's time, and there's a whole host of people that are responsible.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Vasu had to leave us, so I am the host now. I'm Kelly. Are there any questions for Jeff before we switch to our last speaker?
I tried to get you back on time, Fabian.
All right, well, if anyone thinks of anything, they can drop one in the chat as well. But if not, then we'll go ahead and move on to our last speaker, who is Dr. Fabian Fernandez. He's an associate professor and extension specialist in soil, water, and climate. So take it away.
Very good. Thank you for that introduction. I'm trying to put this in presentation mode. Okay, there we go. So thank you. And so today I will be talking about nitrogen cycling and that relationship that exists between crop production and environmental protection. And let me first hide this control so I can actually see the screen. All right, so as a nutrient management specialist, I have responsibilities basically across the state to look at the impact of nitrogen, not only on crop production, but the environment. And in preparation for this presentation, I actually started to tally how many studies and how many plots and how many treatments I've had over the last 7 years since I came to Minnesota. And you can see there in the map kind of the location of a lot of our study sites. And over the last 7 years, I have had research on 106 sites and over almost 3,000 treatments in total across all of those almost 12,000 plots. So a lot of research on nitrogen management, and the ability to do all of these really rests on a very strong team. We have a lot of people, very committed people to help with all this research. And the top picture there shows what you would see pretty much any given day during the growing season, where we have people and equipment going every direction in the state to accomplish this work. And so I really, as I prepared this presentation, I thought 15 minutes to talk about what. And so rather than going in depth on a specific project, I decided that I would try something different, and I would allow my students to do the depth presentations when they finish their degrees. Some of them have already finished, some of them are finishing. And I will just present in a very general way a lot of the research that we have been doing over the years, and hopefully put it into a cohesive story that makes sense. You know, when we look at the conditions that we are in Minnesota, we are seeing warmer winters, and we are also seeing wetter conditions, especially wetter conditions during the spring portion of the growing season. And these two things combined really result in a lot of challenges for nitrogen management, not only in terms of the crops and the need for additional nitrogen, but also in terms of environmental quality. And all of these factors, along with all the changes that are happening in hybrids, in management situations that are kind of represented by different tractors across the decades, all these things are coming together and making it a challenge really to manage nitrogen. Maybe the things that worked before are not necessarily working today, and we need to continue to do research in order to understand these conditions and these situations. And nitrogen is a very important nutrient because corn is extremely responsive to nitrogen. So the farmers on one hand cannot afford to under-apply nitrogen because that creates nitrogen deficiency, which results in reduced yield, reduced return on the investment. But on the other hand, if we over-apply nitrogen, we are not only reducing profitability, but we are also impacting the environment in a negative way. And I could talk about a lot of different things today in terms of the research that we are doing, looking at nitrogen source, timing, placement, etc. But really and truly, when we think that everything else managed correctly, the major question is typically how much nitrogen to apply. And there are a lot of challenges in answering that question. Two major components to that is, first is the corn needs and the ability to take up nitrogen. So there are conditions during the growing season that may impact how much of that nitrogen that is in the soil is available to the plant, just because of how the plant responds to the environment that is growing in. The other part is corn available nitrogen, and that has to do with, well, external inputs, of course, you know, how much we apply, but also a lot of processes that are part of the nitrogen cycle, such as mineralization and immobilization, leaching losses, gaseous losses. And so I'll talk primarily today about this part of mineralization, and I'll touch briefly on some of the others. In many of the studies, pretty much all the studies that I do, I try to have a nitrogen response curve along with whatever else we are measuring. And this is part of a large database that is used for determining the nitrogen rate that we use as a calculator for the state that farmers use to determine how much nitrogen to apply. And in each one of these studies, we basically have a zero nitrogen treatment. And that allows us to look at how much yield we get out of that check plot. And we can ask the question, how much yield can we get from the natural supply in Minnesota? And that natural supply, of course, is mineralization, is deposition, is nitrogen that is fixed and is being released from the soil for the plant. And so, but certainly mineralization is a huge component of that. And so what you're seeing here is 3 different cropping systems: continuous corn, corn after soybean, and corn, soybean, and the yields that we obtain on those check plots with no nitrogen. And you see there is quite a bit of a distribution. We go anywhere from about 13.7 megagrams per hectare to down to about 3 megagrams per hectare in yield. And the average across all of those studies is about 7.3 megagrams. Now, if we calculate or estimate how much nitrogen it takes to that yield as a rough estimate, we see that in Minnesota, we get anywhere from 65 kilograms to 250 kilograms of nitrogen supply on a given year through natural processes. And on average, about 146 kilograms are supplied. And so there is a substantial, huge amount of nitrogen that can be supplied through natural processes, and we need to better understand these things. As I mentioned, I will not be covering in any level of detail these studies, but I do want to highlight the fact that many people have worked in different projects, and so I put their names typically on the top corner of the screen with a green background. This is, some of you probably listened to Jared Spackman. He just finished his PhD this summer, looking at M15 as a way to understand what happens to the fertilizer that we apply. And what you're seeing here is in the top figure is different nitrogen rates and also timing of application. And then on the y-axis, you are seeing the fertilizer-derived nitrogen. Because it's a labeled fertilizer, we're able to distinguish what comes from the fertilizer versus the soil. And so the brown is the total inorganic nitrogen, and the other form is the organic nitrogen. And you see that the majority of the fertilizer that we apply, so the first set of bars there on the left is soil samples that we took right after the application, about 8 days after application. You see that in general, across all those treatments, 85% of that nitrogen that we apply was in the organic nitrogen form. And, so, and only a very small fraction was in the plant available inorganic nitrogen form. And as we progressed through the season from 8 days after the application to VA to R1 and post-harvest, and then into the following year, we see that the majority of the nitrogen that we apply really becomes part of that organic fraction, and it's organic or maybe fixed in the clay particles. We did not separate, but certainly is in the soil. So the process of mineralization is really important, not only in terms of supplying nitrogen from the organic matter, but also what we apply as a fertilizer ends up becoming some pool that is not necessarily plant available, that has to be processed in order to become available to the plant. And then on the bottom graph, what you're seeing is the amount of fertilizer-derived N versus soil-derived nitrogen for these treatments. And it's pretty clear that at the early part of the season at V8, we have a good amount of nitrogen that is derived from the fertilizer. But as the season progresses, increasingly, we see that more and more the soil is the one that supplies most of the nitrogen available. And then during the second year, a very small amount of the nitrogen that we apply on the first year is actually available, and most of it is coming either from the organic fractions or the nitrogen that is fixed. This is a little bit misleading the second year simply because we also apply nitrogen that was not labeled, and that is included in the dark soil derived M bars. Nonetheless, we see that the soil really becomes the predominant supplier of nitrogen. And we know there is a good relationship between organic matter and the potential for nitrogen to be mineralized. And so this is a study where Karina Fabrizzi helped me with this analysis. We took around 60 samples from different places throughout the state, different soils, and we incubated this in the lab, look at the potential mineralizable nitrogen, and we find that there is a nice linear relationship with, as we increase organic matter, we also increase the amount of potential mineralizable nitrogen. But then you look at some of these extremes that I highlighted, where we are basically having about the same amount of organic matter and very similar soil texture, and yet the potential for mineralizable N is substantially different. And so that begs the question, what makes these soils so different? What other factors are there that make them so different in terms of their potential for mineralization? And that was one of the major questions that Jason Clark, one of the students that finished his PhD a couple of years ago now, focused on his research. He had a very large study with many collaborators across the Midwest and 49 site years of data. And he was very prolific on publishing the research. There are 4 papers there listed of some of the stuff that he was trying to understand in terms of mineralization. And he looked at many different factors to try to understand mineralization and understanding how we can better use potential mineralizable nitrogen measurements as a way to predict nitrogen needs or predict corn grain yield, things like that. And he looked at weather, texture, bulk density, total organic carbon, total organic nitrogen, and another host of variables to try to explain these things. And we were able to find very little explanation using all these variables. And so that, I think, highlights, and again, not time to show all these results, but it highlights the complexity that we are working against in terms of trying to use mineralization or predicting mineralization in order to know how much nitrogen we need to apply. Another aspect of that is, okay, we do a lot of studies in the lab as with mineralization to determine how much is the potential of the soil. These are incubated typically at ideal conditions. The question then is how much of that really is true in the field. And so this is a picture of one of the sites where Gabriel Payao is doing his PhD right now. I will not be talking about the results from his actual project, but this is a very intense project where we have drained and undrained soil conditions. This is a study site that Seth Nave in agronomy started in 2011. And I've been fortunate to be working on this site since 2014. Where we have the drain and undrained, corn and soybean, both crops present, and then we added tillage systems, conventional, strip till, and no till. So as you can see, it's a very big project, and Gabriel will be talking in detail about it as he finishes his degree next year. But part of the study that we did in here was a mineralization study where Karina Fabrizzi was also involved. And first of all, we did an incubation study in the lab, and those are the results that you see on the top. You have there corn on the left and soybeans on the right with no nitrogen on the top or with nitrogen applied, either 200 kilograms or 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for the corn and the soybean. And then we look at the potential mineralizable N in this incubation study for both the drained and the undrained soils. And we see there is a huge amount of mineralizable N that can become available on a given year under those ideal conditions. And then the question is, do these things really reflect what happens in the field? And so we did an incubation study in situ in the field for 2 years, in 2014 and 2015. And first of all, there were some important differences in those soils from the start because of the drainage conditions in the undrained side of the field. We had 21% more total organic carbon and 12% more total nitrogen than the drained side. And in that study, when we were doing the in situ incubation, we found 2.7 times greater net nitrogen mineralization in the undrained soil than the drained soil, but only under the unfertilized control. When we look at the drainage effect where we apply nitrogen, then there was a lot of inconsistency. And just to kind of quickly illustrate this point, in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a little table there where I made some statements about certain situations where the answer to each one of these situations was yes in the incubation study. For instance, adding nitrogen in drain increased net mineralization. In the incubation study, the answer is yes. Adding nitrogen in a drain decreased net mineralization, yes. Soils with corn residue had less net mineralization than soils with soybean residue, yes. And drain conditions had greater net mineralization than undrained conditions, yes. And then we look at those same scenarios, but in the field in 2014 and 2015, and we find that the answers to those questions is not always yes. And sometimes there are caveats, and maybe yes, but only for certain treatments. And so this again highlights the challenge of predicting mineralization. The only thing that changed between 2014 and 2015 in this site was the conditions, the season conditions, the weather conditions, and able to explain some of these differences very well. And so that's a substantial challenge, again, in trying to predict mineralization. The other aspect to mineralization that I haven't touched on yet is that in addition to impacting the agronomic performance of the crops or the efficiency of the fertilizer, the other part is the environment and how mineralization can have impacts on the environment. This is a study site in Westport, Minnesota. It's a study that started the rotations that you see there, continuous corn, corn, soybean, and soybean corn, were established in 2011. We have had a number of different treatments in there, and several students have graduated from this project. Annie Nelson, Natalie Ricks, and Jessica Wayman is currently working on that project. And then Eduardo Garay just started his PhD, and he may be working on this, we will see. But we have had many different treatments with different nitrogen rates, sources, timings, and things like that. And then now we are also looking at cover crops. I will not touch on any of the research on the cover crops, but the important thing out of this study is that if you look there, there are some pipes sticking out of the side of the fields of those 3 rotations where we have permanently installed suction cup lysimeters below the root zone. So we are able to measure nitrate leaching and also calculate the drainage and calculate load out of that to see how much of the nitrogen that we apply, the treatments that we have, how much nitrate occurs. And this has been a study that has been going on again for a number of years. We have many partners there. We have the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the Polk County Soil and Water Conservation District helping us in this project. And so what we did in this study was look at the potential mineralizable nitrogen. And so that's what you see on the left. We have on the top is corn, middle is corn soybean, and the bottom is soybean corn for 2 nitrogen rates, 0 and 315 kilograms of nitrogen. And again, doing an incubation, aerobic incubation, we see that there is a huge potential for mineralization in this soil. This is a sandy soil, a sandy loam soil, but it has 4.5% organic matter, so very high organic matter content. And the interesting thing is that even though we have had different studies, some plots, a good number of plots, had no nitrogen applied since 2011. And so I've been looking at the concentrations. This is the average from 2011 to 2019. For the 3 systems, corn, soybean, and soybean corn. We are looking here at the mean concentration. These are mean annual concentrations and then average across the years. And we see that it goes anywhere from 9 to almost 24 parts per million nitrate nitrogen in the drainage that of the water that goes below the root zone. In this study that has, again, received no nitrogen, these plots have not received no nitrogen since 2011. And then in terms of cumulative load, again, anywhere from 34 to 86 kilograms of nitrate nitrogen per hectare are leached every year. When I look at those values and I consider the amount of cumulative load that we see for the nitrogen rates that are receiving the economic optimum end rate, basically the amount of nitrogen that is leaching out of these check plots with no nitrogen represent about 40% of the total load in continuous corn, about in after soybean. So mineralization is not only again important for the production of the environmental impacts. And one of the reasons for which this is interesting is, why do we get so much loss when we are applying no nitrogen? And I think a large part of that is the fact that these soils are mineralizing nitrogen early from the start of the growing season. As soon as the soils start to warm up, we see here a number of nitrogen rates, and then the dark line represents the drainage, which is on the right-hand axis. And we see that about 75% of the drainage, this is on average across the years, this is just 1 year as an example, 75% of the drainage happens during the May through June period, and about 73% of the load happens during that same time frame. So this is before plants are even starting to really grow. And actually, a lot of times we don't even have had time to apply much nitrogen. And so what you're seeing is a lot of these has to do with what is mineralized and coming out of the system before the plants are able to even use it. And in talking about timing, and this is my last slide of data, we talk about timing as a way to manage nitrogen more efficiently. And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the fact that the climate is changing and it's impacting management is very true based on some of the data that we are seeing here. This is a study that Sonia Menegas is doing at the at Lamberton in the Southwest Research and Outreach Center, where we are looking not only at the agronomics, at corn yields, but we are also looking at nitrate leaching. These are tile drain sites. So the top on the left top graph shows the nitrate, the cumulative nitrate leaching. The bottom graph on the left is the ammonia, the cumulative ammonia load, and then the graph on the right is the nitrous oxide cumulative load. And these are just different years, but it shows or represents, gives a good illustration of what we are seeing here. The green arrows show when the split application was added, and the split applications, so trying to divide how much nitrogen goes before planting versus how much goes later when the plant is able to take up nitrogen. Those split applications are the treatments with the dotted lines. And we see in all of these examples that the split application actually resulted in greater loading of nitrate, ammonia, and nitrous oxide, simply because it had to do more with what happened after that application. In all of these examples here, after the application, we had substantial rain, which resulted in more loss than when we did the pre-plant application of these treatments. And again, we don't have time to go into the details of what treatments are what, but that split application, of just simply saying, well, timing will solve some of these issues, it's not really related to the management. It has a lot more to do with the environmental conditions. And so a very complex situation in terms of managing nitrogen correctly, and trying to understand the mineralization process as well as the loss mechanisms. And so this is kind of in a nutshell, very quickly, a lot of the research that my group is doing. But again, I want to take the opportunity and highlight that all of this is possible because this huge team of very dedicated people. I feel very fortunate to have a wonderful field crew, wonderful students, wonderful researchers along my side to help me with all this research that we are currently doing. And so with that, I will stop, and if there is time for questions, I will try to answer them.
All right, thank you, Fabian. Are there any questions for Fabian? Or I believe Melissa is also still here as well.
too much stuff to process. And probably when I started to get hungry,
Checking the
we don't have the
chat.
snacks that we normally have in the seminar when we meet on campus.
It's true. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but thank you all for being here today. And thanks to Melissa and Jeff and Fabian for sharing your research. We have another seminar again in 2 weeks. It'll be Barbara Beacons from the USGS. So please join us then for that. Thanks
Yep.
again.
Thank you, Kelly. Bye.